They told him the mine had been sealed for 2 years, but Sergeant Marcus Hayes heard metal striking stone from somewhere deep in that black throat of earth, and he knew someone down there was still alive. Not echoes, not wind. Someone was digging. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. The Nevada desert stretched flat and merciless under the August sun, heat shimmering off the sand in waves that made the horizon dance. Sergeant Marcus Hayes wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, the rough cotton of his uniform already soaked through at the armpits and collar. Behind him, 8 men of the 477th Engineer Battalion stood in loose formation, shovels and pickaxes resting against their shoulders, canteens hanging heavy from their belts. This was their 3rd day running fence line repairs along the outer perimeter of Camp Desert Rock, 20 miles from the nearest town, where the Army had decided to station an all-black engineering unit for what they called essential wartime construction duties. What that really meant was digging latrines, stringing barbed wire, and clearing rocks from roads that white units would eventually use. Hayes had stopped questioning it 6 months ago. The work was the work, and complaining only made the days longer. Private Lewis, the youngest of the squad at 19, kicked at a rusted tin can half buried in the sand. "Sarge, how much longer are we going to be out here? My canteen's about dry." Hayes glanced at the sun, judging the angle. Past 2 o'clock, maybe closer to 3. They'd been working since dawn with only a brief stop for cold beans and hardtack at noon. His own throat felt like sandpaper, but showing weakness wasn't an option. Not when every pair of eyes looked to him for direction. "Another hour," Hayes said. "Then we head back. Crawford, you and Perkins finish that post section. Lewis, quit kicking things and help them." The men moved without complaint, their movements efficient despite the heat. Hayes had trained them well, or maybe the Army had simply beaten the resistance out of them the same way it had beaten it out of him. Either way, they worked. That's when he saw it. 50 yards to the east, partially hidden by a cluster of dead Joshua trees, a dark opening gaped in the base of a rocky hillside. Hayes frowned. He'd walked this section of fence line twice before, and he couldn't remember seeing that mine entrance. But then again, the desert had a way of hiding things until you stumbled right into them. "Hold up," Hayes called. The hammering stopped. "Any of you see that mine before?" Corporal Washington, a barrel-chested man from Mississippi who'd been in the unit longer than anyone, squinted toward the hillside. "Can't say I have, Sarge. Looks old, though. Real old." Hayes walked closer, his boots crunching on the sun-baked earth. The mine entrance was maybe 6 feet high and 4 feet wide, the opening ringed with rotting timbers that had turned gray with age. Railroad tracks, so rusted they were barely recognizable, disappeared into the darkness. A faded sign, weathered to near illegibility, hung crooked from a nail. Hayes could just make out the words, "Copper Ridge Mine No. 7, closed by order, 1942. 2 years, Hayes muttered. "Been sealed 2 years." "Don't look sealed to me," Washington said, coming up beside him. He was right. The entrance stood wide open, no boards across it, no chains. Just that black hole leading down into the earth. Hayes was about to turn away, about to call the men back to work when he heard it. Clang. The sound came from deep inside the mine, faint but unmistakable, metal on stone. Then again, 3 seconds later. Clang. Then silence. "You hear that?" Washington whispered. Hayes nodded slowly. "Yeah, I heard it." The squad gathered behind them, voices dropping low. Lewis stepped forward, his young face curious rather than cautious. "Maybe it's just rocks settling. Old mines do that, don't they?" "Rocks don't settle in rhythm," Hayes said. He listened again. Clang, clang, pause, clang. "That's deliberate." "Could be kids," Private Hawkins suggested. "Teenagers messing around." 20 miles from the nearest town. Washington shook his head. "Nobody's hiking out here for fun." Hayes stared into the darkness. Every instinct told him to walk away, to report what they'd heard to Lieutenant Morrison back at camp and let the white officers make the decisions. That was the safest play, the smart play. But something about that sound, that deliberate metallic rhythm, pulled at him. Someone was down there. And if someone was down there, they might need help. "Washington, Lewis, grab the flashlights from the truck. The rest of you, stay here. If we're not back in 20 minutes, you head straight to camp and report this. Sarge, maybe we should— That's an order, Hawkins. Washington and Lewis jogged back to the truck and returned with 2 heavy Army-issue flashlights. Hayes tested his, the beam cutting a pale yellow shaft through the desert air. Then he stepped into the mine entrance, Washington and Lewis flanking him. The temperature dropped immediately, the desert heat replaced by a damp coolness that smelled of earth and stone and something else, something organic and faintly sour. The flashlight beams swept across walls of rough-hewn rock, ancient support timbers, and narrow-gauge rails that led deeper into the hillside. Their boots echoed on the stone floor. Hayes moved slowly, one hand touching the wall to keep his balance as the mine sloped downward. The entrance light faded behind them, swallowed by the dark. "Sarge," Lewis whispered, "this don't feel right. Keep moving." They descended maybe 50 yards, following the curve of the tunnel as it bent left then right. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe. Hayes's flashlight beam caught something on the wall, something that made him stop. Scratches, deep gouges in the stone, clustered in groups. He moved closer, running his fingers over them. Not random. These were marks, deliberate marks. Someone keeping count. "Look at this," Washington said, his light illuminating the opposite wall. More scratches, but these formed letters. Crude, desperate letters carved into the rock with something sharp. Hayes read them slowly, his German rusty but functional. "Drei Wochen, kein Wasser, Gott hilf uns, 3 weeks, no water, God help us." "Jesus Christ," Lewis breathed. "Sarge, what is this?" Before Hayes could answer, the sound came again, louder now, closer. Clang, clang, clang. The 3 men looked at each other in the dim flashlight glow. Then Hayes moved forward faster now, his heart hammering against his ribs. The tunnel opened into a wider chamber, maybe 20 feet across, the ceiling lost in shadow. Hayes swept his flashlight in a wide arc, and the beam caught them. 7 men, huddled against the far wall. They wore grey, torn, filthy grey uniforms. Their faces were gaunt, eyes sunken, lips cracked and bleeding. One of them held a rusted pickaxe, frozen in mid-swing against the stone. When the flashlight hit them, they threw up skeletal arms to shield their eyes, crying out in hoarse German, "Nicht schießen, nicht schießen, don't shoot, don't shoot!" Hayes's hand went instinctively to his sidearm, but he didn't draw it. Washington and Lewis stood behind him, their flashlights joining his to illuminate the chamber. German POWs, 7 of them, barely alive. One of the prisoners, an older man with a beard matted with dirt, crawled forward on his knees, hands raised. "Bitter," he croaked. "Bitter Wasser, water, please." Hayes's mind raced. The nearest POW camp was Camp Clark, 15 miles south. These men had escaped, had to have escaped. The carved message said 3 weeks. 3 weeks hiding in this mine, slowly dying of thirst and starvation. "Sarge?" Lewis's voice was high, panicked. "What do we do?" Hayes didn't answer. He couldn't answer, because standing in that chamber, looking at 7 enemy soldiers who should have been his prisoners, he realized he was holding the kind of decision that could end his career, his freedom, maybe his life. Report them, and they'd likely be executed for escaping. Every man in this chamber knew that. The desperate hope in their eyes told him they knew that. But if he didn't report them, if he did anything else, he'd be aiding the enemy. Court-martial, treason, firing squad. The old German with the beard crawled closer, his breath rattling. "Bitter," he whispered again. Then, in broken English, Information. We have information. Important. Please." Washington stepped beside Hayes, his voice low. "Sarge, we got to make a call here. Whatever you decide, we're with you. But we got to do it now." Hayes stood frozen, his flashlight beam steady on the 7 dying men who wore the uniform of the enemy, who had families back in Germany, just like he had family back in Georgia, who were someone's sons and brothers and maybe fathers. And one of them, he suddenly noticed, looked impossibly young, 16 at most, just a boy. The same age as his little brother Robert, who was somewhere in France right now, fighting these same people. The boy German stared back at him with eyes that held no hate, only fear and desperate hope. Hayes's hand slowly released his sidearm. "Get the water," he said quietly. Lewis ran. His boots hammered against stone as he sprinted back through the tunnel toward daylight, toward the truck where the canteens waited. Washington stayed close to Hayes, his flashlight sweeping the chamber as the 7 Germans remained motionless, watching, waiting. Hayes kept his hand near his sidearm but didn't draw it. These men weren't a threat. They could barely lift their arms, let alone attack. The oldest one, the bearded man who had spoken, was still on his knees, his breathing shallow and ragged. The others leaned against the rock wall like broken dolls, their uniforms hanging loose on frames that had been starved down to bone and sinew. "How long?" Hayes asked in German, his accent rough but understandable. "How long have you been here?" The bearded man's eyes widened slightly at hearing his own language. "3 Wochen," he whispered. 3 weeks. We escaped. From Camp Clark. They were transferring us. The truck. There was an accident. 4 guards died. We ran. Washington shifted beside Hayes. "Sarge, if guards died during an escape, I know." Hayes cut him off. He knew exactly what that meant. Escaped POWs were one thing. Escaped POWs from an incident where American soldiers died was something else entirely. These men wouldn't just face military prison, they'd face a firing squad, no questions asked. The bearded German coughed, a wet, rattling sound. "We found this mine. We thought we could hide, wait for the war to end. Foolish. No water, no food. We tried to dig deeper, find water. Nothing." One of the other prisoners, a thin man with a bloody bandage wrapped around his left hand, spoke up in heavily accented English. "We are dying. Please, we surrender. Again." He managed a weak, bitter smile at his own words. Hayes heard boots running. Then Lewis appeared at the chamber entrance, his arms full of canteens. "Got 6 of them, Sarge. That's all we had in the truck. Give them here." Lewis handed over the canteens one by one. Hayes approached the Germans slowly, watching their faces. The desperation there was real, no question about it. These weren't soldiers planning an ambush. These were men who had given up everything except the will to survive. He unscrewed the first canteen and handed it to the bearded man. "Slowly. Small sips. If you drink too fast, you'll vomit." The German took it with shaking hands, brought it to his cracked lips, and drank. Tears ran down his dirt-caked face as the water touched his tongue. He pulled the canteen away after 3 swallows, gasping, then passed it to the man beside him. Hayes distributed the other canteens. The Germans drank in turns, helping each other, their movements careful and controlled despite their obvious thirst. They had discipline even now. Even dying in a hole in the ground, they maintained some shadow of military order. The youngest one, the boy Hayes had noticed before, took the last canteen. His hands trembled so badly he almost dropped it. Washington stepped forward and steadied it for him, helping him drink. The boy's eyes met Washington's, and something passed between them. Understanding, maybe, or just shared humanity in a moment that transcended the uniforms they wore. After they'd drunk, the bearded German looked up at Hayes. "Thank you. I am Hauptmann Werner Kessler, Captain. These are my men." Hayes nodded. "Sergeant Marcus Hayes, 477th Engineer Battalion." He paused. "You said you had information, important information." Kessler glanced at his men, then back to Hayes. When he spoke, his voice was low, urgent. "There is a plan, a sabotage operation. We learned about it at Camp Clark before we escaped." "What kind of sabotage?" "The shipyards, on the west coast. There are men inside working as civilians. German operatives who were already in America before the war. They plan to destroy 3 ships, supply vessels being loaded for the Pacific." Kessler coughed again, wincing. "Thousands of tons of ammunition and fuel. If those ships explode in harbor..." Hayes felt his stomach tighten. "When?" 2 weeks, maybe less. We heard them talking in the camp. 2 other prisoners, SS men who were being held separately. They were boasting about it to each other. Didn't know we could hear them from the next cell. Kessler's eyes held Hayes's. "I was going to tell the camp commander. But then the transfer happened, the accident, we ran." "Why should I believe you?" Hayes asked, though even as he said it, he knew the answer. These men had nothing to gain by lying. They were already facing execution for escaping. Inventing a sabotage plot wouldn't save them. Kessler reached into his torn uniform jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, stained with dirt and sweat. I wrote down everything I heard, names, dates, the ships, the operative's contact code. It is all here. I was Wehrmacht sergeant, regular army, not SS, not Nazi. I do not want thousands of American boys to die because I was too afraid to speak. Hayes took the paper carefully, unfolded it. The writing was in German, cramped and small, covering both sides, names he didn't recognize, numbers that might be codes, and at the bottom underlined 3 times, SS Sturmbahnführer Klaus Richter, Camp Clark, Cell Block D. This SS man, Hayes said. Richter, he's still at the camp. Yes, he and his second. They are being held for war crimes. They think they are important, that they will be traded for American prisoners. They do not know we heard them. They do not know we escaped. Washington leaned close to Hayes. Sarge, even if this is real, how do we verify it? We can't just walk into Camp Clark and start asking questions. And if we report these men first, they'll be executed before anyone bothers to check their story. Hayes folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. The weight of it felt heavier than it should have. This wasn't just a piece of paper. This was a decision that would branch in a dozen directions, each one leading somewhere he couldn't predict. He looked at the 7 Germans again. They watched him with the quiet resignation of men who had already made peace with death. All except the boy, whose eyes still held a flicker of desperate hope. "What's your name?" Hayes asked the boy in German. The boy straightened slightly. "Dieter Holst, private. I was drafted 6 months ago. I turned 16 in April." 16. The same age as Robert. Hayes thought of his brother's last letter, written from somewhere in France, talking about the cold and the mud and how he missed Mama's cooking. Robert was 16 and fighting Germans. This boy was 16 and dying in a Nevada mine. The war had a way of making the world very small and very large at the same time. Hayes turned to Washington and Lewis. "Here's what's going to happen. We're going back to the truck. We're going to tell the others we found some old mining equipment and a partial cave-in that needs to be reported. Then we're going back to camp." "And them?" Lewis asked, gesturing toward the Germans. "We bring them food and water tonight, after dark. Enough for a few days. Then I figure out what to do next." Washington's face was unreadable. "Sarge, that's aiding the enemy. That's a court-martial offense. I know what it is. If anyone finds out..." "I said I know what it is." Hayes's voice was hard. "You got a problem with that, Corporal?" Washington was quiet for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "No, Sarge, no problem. Whatever you need." Lewis swallowed hard but nodded. "I'm in too." Hayes looked at the 7 Germans one more time. "You stay quiet. Don't make noise. Don't try to signal anyone. If another patrol finds you before I come back, you're on your own, understand?" Kessler nodded slowly. "We understand." "Thank you, Sergeant Hayes. You are a good man." Hayes didn't respond to that. He wasn't sure if what he was doing made him good or stupid or something else entirely. All he knew was that walking away and letting these men die without at least checking their story felt wrong in a way he couldn't ignore. He turned and walked back toward the tunnel, Washington and Lewis following. Behind them, in the darkness of that forgotten chamber, 7 enemy soldiers sat in silence, clutching empty canteens and hoping that an American sergeant they'd met 10 minutes ago would save their lives. The sunlight hit Hayes's eyes as they emerged from the mine, harsh and blinding after the darkness. The rest of the squad waited by the truck, standing in the shade of the vehicle. "Everything all right, Sarge?" Hawkins called out. Hayes walked past them toward the truck. "False alarm, just some old equipment and a cave-in. Let's finish that fence line and head back." The men exchanged glances but didn't question him. They'd learned long ago that when Sergeant Hayes said something, you didn't push for details unless he offered them. As they loaded the tools into the truck, Hayes looked back at the mine entrance one last time. That black opening in the hillside looked exactly the same as it had an hour ago, but everything had changed. He had crossed a line. The question now was whether he'd crossed it for the right reasons, and whether he could cross back before it destroyed him. That night, lying in his bunk at Camp Desert Rock, Hayes couldn't sleep. The paper with the German names and codes was hidden inside his footlocker, wrapped in an old shirt. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Dieter Holst's face, That 16-year-old boy who looked like he should have been worried about school dances and baseball games instead of dying in a hole in the ground. He thought about the sabotage operation. If it was real, if those ships exploded in a harbor packed with workers and sailors, the death toll would be catastrophic. But if he reported the Germans first, they'd be shot before anyone took their intelligence seriously. Escaped POWs weren't exactly trusted sources. There had to be a way to verify the information without revealing where it came from. But how? The answer came to him around 3 in the morning as he stared at the ceiling and listened to the other men snore. He'd have to go to Camp Clark himself, not as a sergeant bringing in escaped prisoners, but as someone else, someone asking different questions. It was a long shot, maybe an impossible shot, but it was the only shot he had. Hayes rolled over and finally closed his eyes. Tomorrow he'd start figuring out exactly how a black engineering sergeant was going to walk into a POW camp and extract intelligence from an SS officer without getting himself arrested. Tomorrow. But first, he had to sneak food and water into an abandoned mine without getting caught. One impossible thing at a time. The moon was a thin crescent, barely enough light to see by. Hayes drove the jeep without headlights, navigating by memory and instinct across the desert floor. In the passenger seat, Washington sat silent, a duffel bag full of stolen rations at his feet. Behind them, the lights of Camp Desert Rock had faded to nothing. "You sure about this, Sarge?" Washington finally asked. Hayes didn't take his eyes off the terrain ahead. "No, but we're doing it anyway." They'd waited until after midnight when the camp settled into its deepest sleep. Hayes had raided the mess supplies, taking what wouldn't be missed immediately. Hardtack biscuits, canned beans, jerky, 6 more canteens of water, enough to keep 7 men alive for maybe 3 more days. After that, he'd have to figure something else out. The mine entrance appeared as a deeper shadow against the dark hillside. Hayes parked the jeep 50 yards away, behind a cluster of rocks, where it wouldn't be visible from the road. They grabbed the duffel bag and moved quietly toward the opening. Hayes clicked on his flashlight only after they were inside the tunnel, the beam pointing down at their feet. The air was cool and still, carrying that same earthy smell mixed with something else now. Sickness, unwashed bodies, death waiting patiently in the dark. They found the Germans exactly where they'd left them, huddled in the chamber like ghosts. Kessler was awake, his eyes reflecting the flashlight beam. The others stirred as Hayes and Washington entered. "You came back," Kessler said, his voice stronger than before. The water had helped. Hayes dropped the duffel bag on the ground. "Food and water. Make it last. I don't know when I can come back." The Germans moved forward slowly, their movement still weak but more controlled than yesterday. They opened the bag with the care of men handling treasure. Private Holst, the boy, pulled out a tin of beans and held it like it was gold. "Thank you," Holst whispered in English. "Thank you." Washington crouched down, helping distribute the rations evenly. Hayes watched Kessler, who hadn't moved to take any food yet. The German captain was studying Hayes with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "You are risking everything," Kessler said quietly. "For us. Why?" Hayes had asked himself the same question a dozen times since yesterday. Because if your information is real, American lives are at stake, and because leaving you here to die doesn't sit right with me. "Even though we are the enemy?" "Even though," Kessler nodded slowly. "You are planning something. I can see it in your face. You are going to verify what I told you." Hayes pulled the folded paper from his pocket. "I need more details. Everything you remember about what you heard. Times, dates, exact words if you can recall them." For the next 20 minutes, Kessler talked while Hayes took notes on the back of the paper. The sabotage plan was more detailed than he'd initially understood. 3 ships at the port of San Francisco, scheduled to depart September 15th. The operatives were working as dock workers, with forged papers identifying them as American citizens. The explosives were already in place, hidden in crates marked as spare parts. The SS men, Richter and his second, they were laughing about it, Kessler said, his voice hard, talking about how the Americans were too trusting, too soft. How when those ships exploded, it would be like Pearl Harbor all over again. He spat on the ground. "I was Wehrmacht, Sergeant. We fought for Germany, yes, but we were soldiers. These SS, they are something else. They enjoy the suffering." "And you're sure Richter is still at Camp Clark?" Unless they transferred him in the last 3 weeks, yes. Cell Block D, he was being held for questioning about civilian massacres in Poland. Hayes folded the paper carefully. The plan forming in his mind was dangerous, possibly suicidal, but it was the only way he could see to verify the intelligence without exposing the 7 men hiding in this mine. "I need something from you," Hayes said. "A name. Someone at Camp Clark who might verify you're telling the truth. Another prisoner who knew you, who could confirm your story if it comes to that." Kessler thought for a moment. Feldwebel Otto Schneider. He was in my company. He was captured at the same time I was. We were in the same barracks before they separated us for the transfer. He knows me. He would vouch for me. Hayes wrote the name down. "All right, I'm going to Camp Clark tomorrow. I'll find a way to talk to this Schneider, see if he confirms what you've told me. How will you do that? You cannot simply walk into a POW camp and demand to speak with prisoners." "I'll figure it out." One of the other Germans, a man with a thick Bavarian accent, spoke up. "Sergeant, if they catch you helping us, they will execute you. You know this, yes?" Hayes met his eyes. "Yeah, I know this." Washington stood up, brushing dust from his knees. "Sarge, we should go. It'll be light in a few hours." Hayes nodded. He looked at the 7 Germans one more time. In the flashlight beam, they looked less like enemy soldiers and more like what they really were. Men. Just men. Caught in something bigger than themselves, trying to survive. "Stay quiet," Hayes said. "Stay alive. I'll be back when I can." Kessler raised his hand in a half salute. "Auf Wiedersehen, Sergeant Hayes, and good luck. You will need it." The drive back to camp was silent. Washington stared out at the desert, his expression unreadable. Finally, as they approached the outer perimeter fence, he spoke. "You got a plan for getting into Camp Clark?" "Working on it. Because that place is locked down tight. They don't just let people wander around talking to prisoners." "I know." Washington was quiet again. Then, "My cousin works there at Camp Clark. He's with the guard detail. Name's Albert Washington. We grew up together in Biloxi." Hayes glanced over at him. "You think he'd help?" "Depends on what kind of help you're asking for. Albert's a good man, but he's also scared of losing his stripes. Camp Clark's not like our outfit. They run it by the book, no exceptions. I'm not asking him to break any rules. Just need him to get me through the gate, maybe point me in the right direction once I'm inside." Washington rubbed his jaw. "I could write him a letter, tell him you're coming. Make up some story about needing to verify supply requisitions or some such. That could work." "Could, but if this goes sideways, Sarge, Albert's going to know I was involved. He's family." Hayes pulled the Jeep into their designated parking area and killed the engine. "Then maybe we don't involve him. Maybe I find another way." Washington sat there for a long moment, staring at his hands. Then he shook his head. "No, I'm already in this. Might as well see it through. I'll write Albert tonight. We'll see what he says." They walked back to the barracks in the pre-dawn darkness. Inside, the other men were still sleeping, their breathing steady and deep. Hayes lay down on his bunk without undressing, too tired to care about the dirt on his uniform. Tomorrow he'd have to act normal, go through the regular duties, pretend nothing had changed. Then somehow he'd have to get to Camp Clark and confirm whether 7 dying Germans in an abandoned mine were telling the truth or just spinning lies to save their own skins. The weight of the paper in his pocket felt heavier than ever. 3 days later, Washington's cousin Albert sent back a telegram. It was brief and carefully worded, but the message was clear. He could get Hayes through the main gate under the pretense of delivering engineering reports. What happened after that was up to Hayes. Hayes stood in Lieutenant Morrison's office, his cap under his arm, trying to look more confident than he felt. Morrison was a decent officer, as white lieutenants went, more interested in getting the job done than proving points. He looked up from his desk with mild curiosity. "You need to visit Camp Clark, Sergeant." "Yes, sir. We've been having issues with our supply requisitions matching what we actually receive. I think there might be a mix-up at their end, since they process some of our paperwork. Thought I'd drive over, check their records, sort it out in person." Morrison frowned. "Can't you just make a phone call?" "I tried, sir. Been trying for a week. Their admin office keeps giving me the runaround. Figure if I show up in person, it'll move things along faster. It was a thin excuse, but Morrison was already looking back at his paperwork, clearly not interested in the minutiae of supply chain management. Fine. Take a vehicle. Be back by evening. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Hayes was out the door before Morrison could reconsider. The drive to Camp Clark took an hour, following the main highway south through flat desert that shimmered in the heat. The camp appeared on the horizon like a small city, guard towers rising against the pale sky, rows of barracks arranged in perfect military precision. Hayes felt his stomach tighten as he approached the main gate. A guard stepped out of the checkpoint booth, his rifle slung but ready. Purpose of visit? Sergeant Marcus Hayes, 477th Engineer Battalion. I'm here to see Corporal Albert Washington. He's expecting me. The guard checked his clipboard, then nodded. Wait here. 5 minutes later, Albert appeared. He was shorter than his cousin, but built the same solid and dependable looking. He shook Hayes's hand with a grip that was professionally firm. Sergeant Hayes, my cousin said you needed some help with supply records. That's right. Albert's eyes held his for a second longer than necessary. There was a question there, unspoken, but clear. Hayes gave a slight nod. Albert returned it. Come on. I'll take you to the admin building. We'll see what we can find. They walked through the camp, past rows of identical barracks where German prisoners sat in the shade or played cards or just stared at nothing. Guards patrolled the perimeter, their faces expressionless. The whole place had the feel of a well-oiled machine, everything in its proper place, everyone following the rules. Your cousin says you're good people, Albert said quietly as they walked. I try to be. He also says you're chasing something dangerous. That true? Hayes didn't answer right away. Finally, maybe. Depends on what I find here. What exactly are you looking for, Sergeant? The truth. And a man named Otto Schneider. Albert's step faltered slightly, but he kept walking. Prisoner? Yeah. You know I can't just let you talk to prisoners. That's way above my pay grade. I know, but maybe you can point me towards someone who can. Albert was quiet for a while. They reached a building marked administration and stopped outside. Albert pulled out a cigarette, lit it, took a long drag. There's a chaplain, he said finally. Father Donnelly, Irish guy. Been here since the camp opened. He talks to the prisoners sometimes, handles mail, that kind of thing. He's got more access than most. If you need to get information from a prisoner without going through official channels, he might be your best shot. Where do I find him? Chapel's at the north end of the camp. But Sergeant, whatever you're doing, be careful. There's rumors about some of the SS prisoners here. Bad rumors. The kind that get people killed. Hayes thought of Kessler's words. Klaus Richter, Cell Block D. I'll be careful, Hayes said. Albert nodded slowly. All right then. Good luck. And tell my cousin he owes me big time for this. I will. Hayes headed toward the chapel, his heart beating hard against his ribs. He was inside Camp Clark now, walking freely through a POW facility with no real authority and a story that would fall apart if anyone looked at it too closely. But somewhere in this camp was a man named Otto Schneider, who might confirm that 7 Germans in a mine weren't just making up stories to save themselves. And somewhere else was an SS officer named Klaus Richter, who might be planning to kill hundreds of Americans. Hayes just had to figure out how to connect those pieces without getting himself shot in the process. The chapel was a simple wooden building at the edge of the camp, painted white, but already fading under the desert sun. A small cross hung above the door. Hayes paused outside, checking over his shoulder to make sure no one was watching too closely, then stepped inside. The interior was cool and dim, rows of plain wooden benches facing a modest altar. A man in priest's vestments knelt at the front, his head bowed in prayer. Hayes waited, standing near the door, until the priest crossed himself and stood. Father Donnelly was younger than Hayes expected, maybe 40, with graying red hair and sharp blue eyes that studied Hayes with immediate curiosity. Can I help you, Sergeant? Father, my name is Marcus Hayes. I need to speak with a prisoner. It's urgent. Donnelly's eyebrows rose. That's an unusual request. Normally, prisoner interviews go through the camp commandant's office. This isn't exactly official. I see. Donnelly walked down the aisle toward Hayes, his footsteps echoing softly. "And what makes you think I can help with unofficial business?" Hayes took a breath. He was committed now. "Because I have information about a sabotage operation that could kill hundreds of American sailors and dock workers, and the only way to verify it is to talk to a German prisoner named Otto Schneider. If I go through official channels, people will ask questions I can't answer. But I'm told you have access." Donnelly stopped a few feet away, his expression unreadable. "That's quite a story, Sergeant. You understand I can't just take your word for it." "I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to let me talk to Schneider for 5 minutes, that's all. If what he tells me doesn't check out, I'll walk away and you'll never see me again." The priest was quiet for a long moment, studying Hayes's face. "And if it does check out, then I stop a lot of people from dying." Donnelly sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Schneider, I know him. Good man, quiet. Doesn't cause trouble. He's in Barracks 12. He paused. "I can get you in there, but if anyone asks, you're helping me deliver mail, understand?" "Yes, Father, thank you." "Don't thank me yet. If this goes wrong, we're both in serious trouble." They walked together across the camp, Donnelly carrying a canvas sack of letters. Guards nodded as they passed, recognizing the priest. Nobody questioned Hayes's presence. Inside Barracks 12, rows of bunks lined both walls. German prisoners looked up as they entered, conversation dying. "Schneider," Donnelly called out in German, "you have a visitor." A man in his 30s rose from a lower bunk near the back. He had a weathered face and careful eyes. He approached slowly, his posture respectful but wary. "Father, this sergeant needs to speak with you. I'll give you privacy." Donnelly stepped away, positioning himself near the door where he could watch for any guards. Hayes kept his voice low, speaking in German. "I need to ask you about Werner Kessler. You knew him." Schneider's face went carefully blank. "Hauptmann Kessler was my commanding officer. He was being transferred 3 weeks ago. I have not seen him since." "The transfer? Was there an accident?" Schneider glanced around nervously. "I am not supposed to talk about that." "I know, but I need you to anyway. Lives depend on it." Schneider's jaw tightened. "Yes, there was an accident. The truck went off the road. 4 American guards were killed. Kessler and 6 others escaped. Do you believe Kessler would lie to save himself?" "No. The Hauptmann was many things, but he was not a liar. He was a good officer. He took care of his men." Schneider's eyes searched Hayes's face. "Why are you asking me this? What does this have to do with—" "There are 2 SS prisoners here, Klaus Richter and another man. Were they ever in the same area as Kessler?" Schneider's expression darkened. "Yes. Cell Block D is adjacent to where we were housed. Sometimes we could hear them talking, bragging. They are animals, those SS." He spat the words. "If Hauptmann Kessler told you something about them, I would believe him." That was all Hayes needed. He pulled out the paper with the sabotage details. "Look at this. Tell me if these names and dates match anything you might have overheard." Schneider read quickly, his face going pale. "Mein Gott, this is—" "Yes. Yes, I heard them talking about ships, about September. I did not understand all of it, but this—" He pointed to a notation about the port of San Francisco. "This I remember. Richter was laughing about it." Hayes folded the paper carefully. "Thank you, Feldwebel Schneider. You may have just saved a lot of lives. Sergeant, if you have seen Hauptmann Kessler, tell him some of us remember our honor, even here." Hayes nodded and turned to leave. Father Donnelly fell into step beside him as they exited the barracks. Once they were outside, the priest spoke quietly. "Did you get what you needed?" "Yes." "Good. Now get out of this camp before someone asks questions I can't answer. There's one more thing. Cell Block D, the SS prisoners. Is there any way to see them?" Donnelly stopped walking. "Absolutely not. Cell Block D is maximum security. You'd need clearance from the commandant himself, and even then—" He studied Hayes's face. "Why?" "I need to see them. Just see them. I need to know what I'm dealing with." "That's suicide, Sergeant. Those men are dangerous and the guards there don't mess around. I'm not asking to talk to them, just a glimpse. That's all." Donnelly shook his head slowly. You're either very brave or very stupid. Cell Block D has a small viewing window in the corridor. If we walk past it, you'll have maybe 3 seconds, that's it. And if anyone asks, you're lost. I'll take it. They crossed the camp toward a separate compound surrounded by its own fence. The guards here were more alert, more heavily armed. Donnelly showed his papers and they were waved through. Inside, the atmosphere was different, colder, more hostile. They walked down a corridor lined with cell doors. Donnelly slowed as they approached a reinforced door with a small window set at eye level. There, that's Richter's cell. Look fast and keep walking. Hayes glanced through the window as they passed. Inside, a man sat on a bunk. He was younger than Hayes expected, maybe early 30s, with close-cropped blonde hair and pale eyes. He looked up as Hayes's shadow crossed the window, and for a brief second, their eyes met. Hayes saw no fear there, no shame, only cold calculation and absolute certainty. This was a man who believed he was right, who believed his cause was just, who would kill without hesitation if given the chance. This was the man whose intelligence could save hundreds of American lives, and the only way to stop him was to trust 7 Germans dying in a mine. Hayes kept walking. They were outside the compound 30 seconds later. "Satisfied?" Donnelly asked. "Yeah, thanks, Father." "Whatever you're planning, Sergeant, do it fast. And may God have mercy on us both." Hayes drove back toward Camp Desert Rock with his mind racing. The intelligence was real. Schneider had confirmed it. Richter was real. The sabotage plot was real. Now he had to figure out how to report it without exposing Kessler and his men. The answer came to him halfway back. It was risky, maybe impossible, but it was the only way he could see to thread this needle. He'd report the intelligence as coming from an anonymous source. A tip received through back channels. The army would investigate, find Richter, and verify the plot independently. By the time anyone asked where the information originated, the sabotage would be stopped, and the source would be irrelevant. It wasn't perfect, but it might work. Hayes pulled off the road near the mine entrance. The sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of orange and purple. He grabbed a canteen and walked to the mine alone this time. The Germans were weaker than before. 3 days on minimal rations had worn them down further. Kessler looked up as Hayes entered the chamber, hope and fear warring in his eyes. "Well," the German captain asked, "your information is good. I verified it. The sabotage plot is real." Relief flooded Kessler's face. "Then you will report it. You will stop them." "I'm going to try, but I need time. Maybe 3 days, maybe 4. Can you hold on that long?" "We have no choice." Hayes set down the canteen and pulled out a small bag of food he'd smuggled from the mess. "This is all I could bring. Make it last." Young Dieter Holst spoke up from the corner, his voice barely a whisper. "Sergeant, what will happen to us?" Hayes looked at the boy, 16 years old, same age as Robert. "I don't know, but I'm going to try to find a way to get you out of this." "How?" "We are escaped prisoners. The guards died during our escape. They will execute us." "Maybe. Or maybe I find a way to bring you back to Camp Clark without it looking like an escape. Make it seem like you got lost, like you were trying to find help. It's a long shot, but—" Kessler interrupted. "No. Do not risk more for us, Sergeant Hayes. You have already risked too much. Stop the sabotage, save those American sailors, that is what matters. What happens to us?" He shrugged. "We made our choices. That's not good enough. It has to be." Hayes stood there in the darkness, looking at 7 men who should have been his enemies, but instead had become something else, something more complicated. They'd given him intelligence that would save American lives. They'd trusted him when they had no reason to, and now they were telling him to let them die. "I'll be back in 4 days," Hayes said, "with food, with water, and with a plan. You stay alive until then. That's an order." Kessler smiled faintly. "You cannot give us orders, Sergeant. We are not your men." "Right now you are. And right now I'm ordering you to stay alive." Back at Camp Desert Rock, Hayes typed up a brief report. Intelligence received from anonymous source regarding sabotage operation targeting San Francisco shipyards. He included the dates, the ship names, the operative descriptions, everything Kessler had given him except where it came from. He sealed the report and handed it directly to Lieutenant Morrison the next morning. "Sir, this came across my desk. I think it's important." Morrison read it, frowned, and read it again. "Where did you get this?" "A source, sir. Someone I trust." "That's not an answer, Sergeant. It's the only one I can give, sir." Morrison stared at him for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone. "I'm sending this up the chain. But Hayes, if this turns out to be false information, your career is over. You understand that?" "Yes, sir, I understand." The next 3 days were the longest of Hayes's life. He went through the motions of his duties, supervised his squad, and waited. At night he drove to the mine with what food and water he could spare, watching the 7 Germans grow weaker despite his efforts. On the 4th day, Lieutenant Morrison called him into the office. His expression was unreadable. "The intelligence was good," Morrison said. "Naval investigators found the operatives at the port of San Francisco. They had explosives hidden in 3 different cargo ships, exactly as your report stated. They arrested 6 men. If those ships had left port—" He shook his head. "You saved a lot of lives, Sergeant Hayes." Hayes felt something loosen in his chest. "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me yet. The brass wants to know where you got that information. They want your source." "I can't give them that, sir." "Can't or won't?" "Both." Morrison leaned back in his chair. "I'm going to tell them you received an anonymous tip, that you followed up on it and it checked out. That's going to raise questions, but I'll do what I can to deflect them. Because whatever happened, whatever rules you bent or broke, the result is that American sailors are alive because of you. That counts for something." "Yes, sir." "Now get out of my office. And Hayes, whatever else you're involved in, finish it, soon." That night, Hayes drove to the mine for the last time. Washington came with him along with 2 other trusted men from the squad. They carried medical supplies, food, and a plan that was probably going to get them all court-martialed. The Germans were barely conscious when they arrived. Kessler looked up with dimming eyes. "Did you stop them? The sabotage?" "Yeah, we stopped them. Those ships are safe." "Good." Kessler's eyes closed. "Good. Now I'm getting you out of here. All of you." "How?" "We're going to drive you close to Camp Clark. We're going to leave you near the perimeter fence where the patrols will find you. We'll make it look like you collapsed trying to get back to the camp, like you were surrendering. It won't save you from charges, but it might keep you from being executed on the spot." "Why?" Dieter Holst asked. "Why do all this for us?" Hayes looked at the boy. "Because you're 16 years old, and you gave me intelligence that saved American lives. Because your captain here showed more honor than some men wearing my uniform, and because if my brother was in your position, I'd hope someone would show him mercy." They carried the Germans out of the mine one by one, loading them into the trucks. The drive to Camp Clark took an hour. Hayes stopped 2 miles from the perimeter, in an area where morning patrols would find them. "This is as far as I can take you," Hayes said. "When they find you, tell them you got lost in the desert. Tell them you were trying to surrender. Don't mention the mine, don't mention me, understand?" Kessler gripped Hayes's hand with surprising strength. "I understand. Thank you, Sergeant Marcus Hayes. You are a good man. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise." Hayes and his men drove away, leaving 7 German prisoners lying in the desert sand, barely alive but with a chance now, a chance Hayes had given them. 6 weeks later, Hayes received an unofficial letter. It came through Father Donnelly, passed hand to hand until it reached him. The handwriting was neat, careful. The letter was from Werner Kessler. All 7 men had survived. They were back at Camp Clark, facing disciplinary action, but not execution. The intelligence they'd provided had been credited to anonymous sources, and somehow, mysteriously, the investigation had never pushed harder than that. Kessler wrote that young Dieter Holst had been transferred to a work camp where POWs helped with farm labor. He was healthy. He was safe. The letter ended with a simple line. "You showed us that even in war, honor is possible. We will not forget." Hayes folded the letter carefully and placed it in his footlocker next to his brother Robert's letters from France. 2 boys, 16 years old, on opposite sides of the world, both caught in a war they didn't start. But because of what happened in that mine, because of a choice one sergeant made when he could have walked away, some of those boys would make it home. That night, Washington found Hayes sitting outside the barracks, looking up at the stars. "Sarge, you all right?" Hayes nodded slowly. Yeah, I think I am. Morrison told me they're recommending you for a commendation for stopping that sabotage operation. I didn't stop it. 7 Germans in a mine stopped it. I just listened. Washington sat down beside him. Still counts. They sat in silence for a while, watching the stars wheel overhead. Somewhere out there, the war continued. Men were dying. Cities were burning. The world was tearing itself apart. But in one small corner of the Nevada desert, 7 enemy soldiers had been given mercy, and that mercy had saved hundreds of lives. Maybe that was all any soldier could do. Make the choice to see the human being behind the uniform. Make the choice to listen when it would be easier to walk away. Make the choice to risk everything for what was right, even when right and wrong weren't as clear as the propaganda posters claimed. Hayes thought of Dieter Holst, working on some farm somewhere, alive because a black engineering sergeant had decided that a 16-year-old boy deserved a chance, regardless of which flag he'd been forced to serve. The war would end someday. The battles would be forgotten, the campaigns reduced to textbook paragraphs, but the choices men made in the dark, the moments of mercy when mercy seemed impossible, those would echo forward in ways no one could predict. Hayes stood up, dusted off his uniform, and walked back into the barracks. Tomorrow there would be more fence lines to repair, more work details, more orders to follow. But tonight, he could sleep knowing that he'd made the right choice. Even if it was the hardest one he'd ever made,